Welcome back to my channel. In this video I'd like to discuss something that during my many years in the cockpit flying civilian light aircraft, military, and finally airline flying, a subject that often doesn't get a lot of attention, but especially for beginners is really important, and that's the use of elevator trim. No matter what kind of flying you're doing, the key to a smooth and precise flight is the proper use of trim, and especially elevator trim. Now I'm going to do a little flight here, and let's head out to the practice area. I'm going to fly this in virtual reality, but when we get to the maneuvers I'll switch over to a 2D panel to give you a better look. Now in this relatively short video I'm going to show you a little bit of the theory of elevator trim and why it is so critical to smooth operation of the aircraft. Then I'm going to discuss some of the differences between trimming a real airplane and trimming the sim, especially with a non-force feedback yoke. Then I'm going to do a short demo of trimming, show you the visual references and how that works. And finally, I'm going to talk about how your selection of a yoke or joystick might be affected by what you learn in this video. Just a little side note here as we're climbing out. I strongly encourage you to try VR flying if you haven't already. Like so many things in life, until you try it, you won't miss it. But once you try it, you'll have trouble living without it. At this point, both X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Simulator have done a good job implementing VR. And don't be misled by YouTube videos like this portraying VR, because it can't capture 1/10 of what VR flying is really like. I know trimming an aircraft in pitch sounds like a fairly basic topic, but I have noticed that whether in a new student in the airplane or someone that I set down for the first time in the simulator, the concept of trim is quite foreign to them. So I thought by making this video it might be a reference that others could also use to introduce people to the idea of trimming the sim. So as we continue heading out to the practice area, let's talk about the system that controls pitch in the aircraft, namely the elevators, and the important role that pitch trim plays if you want to control your airplane precisely and smoothly. So to understand aircraft pitch control, we're going to have a little physics for pilots, and for that we'll return to the playground. For simplified understanding, you can think of the aircraft in pitch much like a teeter-totter. When the riders position themselves correctly, the teeter-totter stays level and won't rotate. But any adult who's ridden a teeter-totter with a child knows that you have to position yourselves closer if you're heavier to keep things balanced in equilibrium. This tendency to rotate, called moment or torque, is a function of the force and the distance from the balance point. If the sum of all the moments applied to the teeter-totter equals 0, then there is no rotation. Now an aircraft has a center of gravity, which is the point about which it'll rotate, much like the fulcrum on the teeter-totter, if moments are applied to the aircraft. But this creates a slightly different situation. Since the fulcrum is on one side and both forces are applied on one side of the teeter-totter, they need to oppose one another to stop rotation. Since the aircraft's lift, shown in blue here, is aft of the center of gravity point for all statically stable aircraft, the tail force must provide a downforce to counterbalance that, but less force due to the long moment arm. This is generally accomplished by extending a fin on the aft of the tail up and down to create a moment to cause the aircraft to pitch up and down. So let's look at our aircraft in level flight. Because the aircraft is flying level, the lift force must equal the weight, and the tail must provide adequate downforce to keep the aircraft from pitching up or down, so that the lift moment and the tail moment are equal. There's no tendency for the aircraft nose to rotate up or down. Now let's look at what happens if the aircraft starts to slow down. To maintain the same amount of lift to keep the aircraft level, the aircraft needs a higher angle of attack because there's less air flowing over the wing. Also, the tail is less effective because there's less airflow there too. So it needs a greater deflection of the elevator. Obviously, the control stick is connected directly to the elevator. So when forces on the elevator increase, the force on the stick would increase also, creating quite a hardship for the pilot, applying constant force and trying to hold that force. That is the reason we need trim. For example, if you're flying final with a 20-pound pull on the stick, it's very hard to feel a few ounces of change that you need to make the precise changes in the flare that you'd like to make. On the other hand, if you can trim the forces out so that the stick has zero force, you can feel even the smallest changes as you make precise inputs, the small inputs that are necessary to fly the aircraft smoothly and precisely. A well-trimmed aircraft can be flown by the fingertips with feather-light control. So now we know we need it. Let's look at what trim actually is and how it works. Most light aircraft have a trim tab, which is a smaller tab located on the elevator that can affect, as we'll see shortly, the position of the elevator. In the cockpit there is normally a wheel where rotating the wheel, top of the wheel in the direction you want the nose to go, will cause the trim to be applied. And many aircraft also have a thumb switch on the yoke or control stick to allow trim to be applied in addition to the wheel, which usually is a manual backup in that case. When the cockpit trim control is actuated, it causes the trim tab to rotate, causing a force which pushes the elevator in the direction necessary to reach the equilibrium position so that the nose is in trim. This eliminates the requirement for the pilot to hold force on the control yoke to hold the elevator in the correct position. Because the elevator is directly linked to the control stick or yoke, the yoke should remain in a constant position as the forces are trimmed out of the elevator. Most standard simulator joystick and control yokes don't operate this way. They have centering springs which pull the yoke back to the neutral center position where there's zero force. We'll discuss how that changes things later. The good news is I can tell you as a pilot with tens of thousands of flight hours that I really didn't notice a difference in the way the trim felt, even though the yoke did move back slightly when I released the pressure as I was trimming out the forces. So let's convert some of this theory into practical application. You can see I've got the throttle quadrant on the left where you'll be able to see the trimming, the aircraft profile on the upper right, and trim off to the left, and then the view out the front window. What we're going to do is get level at about 2,000 feet here, heading towards the southwest, and then what we'll do is I'm going to change speeds. You can see we're about 90 knots now. What I'm going to do is change the speed, and we're going to watch the changes that are required in the trim. Initially, I'm going to demo this without making any trim changes. I'm just going to hold the pressure on the stick. Okay, here I'm pulling the power back and just allowing the airspeed to bleed off. And you can see the pitch attitude with the reference to the glare shield, just trying to hold that zero VVI by just increasing the back pressure, pulling a little harder and a little harder. And as we get back to about 70 after 20 knots, quite a bit of force on the stick. What I'm going to do here is just release the stick and just see how fast the nose starts to drop. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm going to recover quickly, pull it back up. I'm going to try that one more time just to show you. Notice the movement of the earth with respect to the nose. Okay, there we go. Now I'm going to make just a little bit of trim change here now, and then try this again. Let me get it leveled off here. And now we'll put a couple turns of trim in, and I'm going to try it. You notice it doesn't drop nearly as fast. Pull it back up. Put a couple more turns of trim in, and then I'm going to let go, and you see it's dropping a lot slower. So you can see that trim really is helping. Now I'm going to put a little more trim in here, and watch what happens when I drop the nose now. It just barely drops. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for trying to find that point where we can let go and the VVI will stay level. That main thing is that the nose doesn't go up or down. It's very consistent, just very slow, and that can't make big changes. Okay, let's speed up and go the other way now. And it takes quite a bit more force to hold that nose down when you get going fast. We'll get it up from that 90 where we started. We'll take it up to 100 or so, maybe 100 knots. And I'm going to hold this nose down and try to get the speed right here. Again, level at 3,000, about 210 heading, and see how quick that nose comes up. It comes up very, very briskly. Let me get it back to level here. Try this one more time. Just let it go, and on it, I'm just letting go of the stick and watching how fast the nose. That's how much just 10 knots can make a trim change. Actually, we went from 70 to 100, so 30 knots. But anyway, a big change in trim. Now. So we'll get this thing leveled off. I'm going to start putting trim in now, nose down trim. And each time I let go of this here, see it comes up a lot slower. So you can see the trim really is, and that's going to be our main cue that we have the airplane level. Unfortunately, unlike in a real airplane, you don't get that seat of the pants feel, and that's a big, big help. Much harder to do it in the sim. Now there we go. We got it trimmed up. Take our hands off. You can see it's almost perfect there. So what I'm going to do now is pull the power back again. And this time I'm just going to trim as I go. Watch me. I'm just trimming back. And each time I trim, I'm kind of easing a little pressure off and seeing if the nose drops. Trying to hold it where it is. I start letting the pressure off. And if the nose starts to go up or down, I just hold that nose in the level attitude and just make the change. And that's how it's done. You got to watch that horizon in the nose or the top of the glare shield and look for the movement and watch it like a hawk, and just make an effort to hold it there as you relieve the pressure with the trim and ease off on the stick until you can release it and there's no relative movement. Just remember, every time you change speed or power, you're going to probably have to make a trim change. It's a constant process. It never stops, and it becomes second nature after not too long a time. Fight the tendency to try to fly the aircraft with trim, fly the airplane with the elevator, and then trim out the forces. Now, I've been flying this in my VR goggles, and only in looking at the video here, I see that I pulled the prop lever back instead of the throttle. And it did seem to respond, but I don't know. Maybe it's set up to be hooked to the throttle also, maybe from another setup. But anyway, much easier to see these pitch changes in VR than it is looking at a 2D screen. I don't know why, but it may be the three-dimensional effect or what, but it's very easy to see when the nose starts to climb and drop. Much easier to fly level, much easier to do everything with VR goggles, and I certainly encourage you to give that a try again. That's my favorite way to fly, although there's still some limitations with really hard training for VFR flying around. You can't beat it. Now, at the beginning of the video, I teased about how the choice of a yoke might be affected by what we've talked about today, and I want to talk a little bit about that to conclude this video. When I first started simming, I came from a long history of military, actually civilian military, and also airline flying, 23,000 hours, so a lot of flying time. And I bought a Saytech yoke. You know, one that looks like this. I got to tell you guys, this yoke just about drove me crazy. I couldn't fly worth a darn, and the main problem was trimming. There's a hard detent, a spring-centered detent that kind of catches every time you go through the center location. Now, we just talked about that. We're trying to fly all the time trimmed, which means zero force. So I'm constantly going in and out of that detent, and it would restrict the movement enough to mess it up. You know, in the flare, I would be kind of zeroed out on the trim, and I'd try to pull back, and nothing would happen, and then I'd suddenly break through that detent, and I'd get an overcorrection, and I hated it. It was terrible, trimming while you're just cruising along. I was always fighting it. I went to Oshkosh and talked to the guys at A2A, and this was quite a while back. But Scott, the owner's son, was working the booth. He couldn't have been more than about 12, maybe 10 or 12 at the time. And he said, I told him about my problem, and he said, I got a CH yoke here. Why don't you try that? So I sat down with this relatively cheap plastic yoke. No way it was made as well as the Satec. It had a plastic shaft, but I was in heaven. This thing was totally smooth. It had no restriction. It was flimsy, but it flew like an airplane. And I decided maybe I will stick with this hobby. I was frustrated by that Satec yoke. Now, I know lots of people fly with the Satec yoke, and I know lots of people have modified the yoke by removing the springs and putting some rubber bands and stuff in there to get rid of that detent. I tried it. I didn't have good luck with that. But that is definitely the problem. That center detent is right where you should be flying almost all the time with a trimmed airplane. And you're constantly having to fight that thing. And for me, it just wasn't worth it. I even tried a few more expensive yokes that didn't have that problem but had sticky shafts. And that's the other thing I'd avoid. A shaft that hangs up or sticks. You need a nice smooth movement. I have a Yoko that has ball bearings and the shaft is very smooth, very well made, but it's expensive. But there's lots of less expensive systems out there, including the Honeycomb, that work just great. They're very smooth, they fly great, and they don't cost an arm and a leg. So that's something I would watch for if you're going to go out and buy a new yoke. And the same thing with joysticks too. Well, in summary, trimming is an important part of flying, and good flying requires good trimming. Using pitch trim on an airplane becomes second nature pretty quick, so not a lot of people talk about it, and that's why I wanted to do this video. Just remember, fly the airplane with the elevator, always put the nose where you want it to be, then use the trim to trim out the forces in the stick. In the case of the simulator, you're going to be easing off the pressure, trimming, easing off. If the nose moves, continue trimming, and will finally eventually be able to release the stick and not have the nose move up or down. That's the goal. The good news is, although it's slightly different in an airplane because the stick actually moves and stays where you trim it, the skills are transferable perfectly to a real airplane. I learned that going the other way, transferring the skills from the airplane to the sim. But I can assure you that you'll have no trouble, and the skills that you learn will be very portable. Finally, if you're having trouble trimming the aircraft, or if you're getting ready to buy a new yoke, you might consider what I've said about the stickiness in center detents. I find those to be pretty much deal breakers for me, and I just thought I'd share that with you. If I had not been a pilot, and I was just starting out with a Satec yoke, I would probably still be using it. And I'm sure eventually you can probably get used to it. But it's definitely negative learning if you ever intend to fly a real airplane. And it, in my opinion, is a lot harder because you're learning to compensate for something that shouldn't really be there. Well, thanks for watching. I know this is a fairly basic video. If it didn't apply to you, you might share it with some of your friends who are just starting out, or maybe guests in your sim, and they might have an idea a little bit about what trim is before they jump into the simulator. If you like my videos, please subscribe, like, share with your friends. I love your comments, especially interested if what you think of this kind of format where it's more of a basic sim instruction instead of some of the more technical things I do. Hope to see you for the next one.